the Federal Reserve's notes look like. Now notice there's nothing here about legal tender. It's just a promise to pay the bearer on demand $20, and it's not $20. So right above where it says $20, I hope you can read the writing. It says, we'll pay to the bearer on demand $20. Turns out that the Federal Reserve was used to help finance World War I on this side of the ocean. It was an enormously profitable enterprise, World War I, for America. And one of the groups that heretofore had been hanging on by its fingernails throughout the 19th century started to be profitable, and those were the farmers. And the reason the farmers always had a difficult time in the 19th century, well, one of the reasons, is that the technology curve, improvements in farm productivity was so great, by the time the farmers would get their produce to market, the price was many times less than it cost them to produce the product. However, with World War I, farming became very profitable because they were selling their goods to Europe. The farms in Europe were decimated. And after World War I, prior to the farms coming back in Europe, the farms were still profitable. And what do you do if you have a very profitable business? Go to the next slide, please. 37. Well, one of the things you do is you look to expand. And if you're a farmer, expanding means buying farmland. And where do you get the money to buy the farmland? Well, you go borrow it from the bank. And where does the bank get the money? The bank starts issuing all through the Midwest these gold certificates and silver certificates for which they did not have gold and for which they did not have silver. And then around 1920, 1921, three things conspired to spoil the party. And the first thing that happened is that the farms in Europe started to come back online, so the farmers started to lose that market. And then the second thing that happened, and people in the East don't know this, but you folks in Montana probably do know this. In those days, a third of all farm produce went to feed the horses. But now the automobile came online, and so they started to lose that market, and then the weather turned bad. And the next thing you know, throughout the early 1920s, you start to get farm defaults, defaults on loans the farmers had to banks, and you start to have bank failures at a very low level. And so what the banks did, and it's very profitable issuing these paper certificates on which they get 8% or whatever interest, they start loaning to industry. And by the mid-1920s, industry is all loaned up. The Ford Motor Companies of the world, they have excess capacity everywhere, no inflation. And so who else to loan to? Well, they start loaning to stock speculators, and they start loaning to real estate people. And in 1929, in October, you had this break in the stock market, and now you start to have many more defaults in the East among big banks on real estate loans and on stock loans. And go to the next slide, please. And then on March 4th, 1933, when Roosevelt came elected, something like 50% of the banks had failed, another 40% had closed. And here Roosevelt, the first thing he did on March 5th, after he was inaugurated on March 4th and March 5th, he freezes all transactions in gold, and he closes. And go to the next slide, please. And really what happened here is that we have the consequences of all this fraudulent behavior by banks in issuing receipts for which they did not have gold. So here Roosevelt seizes all the citizens' gold, makes it a felony for Americans to own gold, and the banks are relieved of their promises to pay gold. Because what had happened is, as these banks were starting to close, people were going to the banks to get their money, and just in case they wanted their gold, but there wasn't enough gold. Nobody else got a pass. And there's speeches in the Congress where a congressman complained that the farmers, they have to pay their mortgages, the mothers have to pay for milk, just the banks didn't have to pay. And now I want to get to what I think is really one of the high points of this presentation, which really illustrates the rank dishonesty, and you have to ask yourself how they got away with this. Now, I'm giving this example. We're up to slide number 40 with silver, but the same thing applies to gold. And here you have an example of a United States note, and you see at the bottom, it says, we'll pay to the bearer on demand $1. Now, this note is not $1. It is a promise to pay $1. And when they say pay $1, what are they talking about? Go to the next slide, please, to slide 41. They're talking about the silver dollar. I mean, when Hamilton wrote the Coinage Act, they wanted to get away from the Spanish mints. They wanted their own mints. And then they break the promise to pay the $1. Go to the next slide, please. And now the broken promise to pay the $1 became $1. I mean, how stupid can stupid be? And so the line that I like, if you take a sign that says a cat, and you hang the sign on a dog, does the dog become a cat? And the answer is no. And if the Congress passes a law that says from now on we're going to call dogs cats, do the dogs become cats? And the answer is no. So going back to Aristotle, things are what they are. So now the dishonored promissory note, the broken promise to pay the money, became the money. And another way to understand this, go to the next slide please, is if you go to a restaurant and you check your coat, and then somebody steals your coat, and you bring back the claim check, and you ask for your coat, and they tell you that the claim check is a coat. And you say, no, it's not a coat. And they say, well, it's legal tender for a coat. This is how they really trick people. It's really, the whole thing is just totally dishonest. This is how they trick people into going to paper money. And go to the next slide, please. And so what's the difference between our paper money and the monopoly money that you have in the poker game? And the answer is there's no difference whatsoever, except that our money is all gussied up with seals and signatures. And go to the next slide, please. One of the things we're very proud of, we're on slide 45 in this country, is what we call the rule of law. And part of the rule of law is that if we enter into voluntary contracts that are not antithetical to public purpose, that the courts will enforce those contracts. And a vital subset of contract law is what we call promises to pay, which are evidenced by what we call promissory notes, also known as notes. And go to the next slide, please. And this is an example of a Federal Reserve note. Now, for a note to be legal, to be a real note, it has to have four elements. It has to have a maker, somebody who's going to make payment. It has to have a payee, somebody who's going to receive payment. It has to have a due date certain and an amount of the note. If any of the elements are missing, that note is not a note, and it's not enforceable. So if I were to buy a car from one of you, for example, and give you a note, say, for $10,000, but not have a due date on it, there'd be no way for you to enforce that. So looking at this slide on page 46, here we have the Federal Reserve note. The maker is the Federal Reserve. Go to the next slide, please. The payee is the bearer. The due date certain is on demand, and the amount of the note is $20 promissory note. And go to the next slide, slide 48. And here you see they took off the payee, and they took off the due date, but they continue to call this a note. This is a misrepresentation. This is not a note. So again, back to my example, if you have a sign that says cat and you hang it on a dog, the dog does not become a cat. These federal notes are not notes. They're really just tokens. And go to the next slide, please. Now imagine if the money we had, folks, if they didn't call it Federal Reserve notes, if they called it Federal Reserve tokens. It'd have a little different matter. What's the difference if it's a real note or not? And the difference is that, go to the next slide, please, or slide 50. In some cases, tokens are better than money. And this is an example of a token. It's a MetroCard. We use it here in Manhattan. You can get 100 rides on mass transit on it. It's better than money. It's better in the sense that it's more convenient. You don't have to fumble around with coins. However, who would take tokens for future payment? Who would allow their pension or their promises of future payment to be denominated in tokens? Okay, and go to the next slide, please. And now is when this presentation really starts to get interesting. So this is a chart of the broad money supply. It's supplied by the data came from the Federal Reserve. It's in billions of dollars, trillions of dollars rather. And the amount of money in this country, the money supply in 1946 was roughly 150 billion, went to something north of 14 trillion. Now this is a metric that the Federal Reserve stopped publishing in March of 2006. However, we know all the components, so we have good proxies for it. Now the shaded portion to the right, that's after the last tie to gold was broken by President Nixon when he defaulted on the sovereign promise to foreign central governments, foreign central banks rather, and governments to redeem dollars for gold. So one of the things I left out of this story, well, Roosevelt seized all the gold